My name is Alyssa Heine. I represent knowledge management, learning and development at Bertec. And this is a new initiative for us at Bertec. What we're trying to do is bring together clinicians in a variety of disciplines that are under the larger umbrella of movement sciences. And what we're hoping to do is discuss some interesting topics that might relate to you all, share some exciting research that's happening in this world, and bring people together for continued conversation. So we'll be hosting these once or twice a month moving forward, and you'll see the invites to those, and you can follow us on YouTube and see those recordings if you missed any. So today I'm very excited because we have Dr. Jaclyn Caccese with us as our presenter, and our host is Dr. Fernando Santos. So I am going to just give you a brief lowdown on the format of the webinar. So we're going to play a pre-recorded presentation that Jaclyn has made for us. And throughout that presentation, please feel free to enter any questions that you have in the chat as they come to mind. And Fernando and Jaclyn will be answering those questions throughout the presentation in chat. And then following the presentation, we're going to host a Q&A. So you'll be able to ask any more questions as they come to mind. So Fernando and I work together at Bertec. He's our host for today. He's an incredibly valuable member of the Bertec staff. I'm going to let him introduce himself more properly, but he's an accomplished physical therapist and PhD who supports Bertec innovation in really a multitude of ways as our senior applied biomechanist. So Fernando, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I don't want to spend much time with me. I think Alyssa already did a really good job introducing myself. I hope everyone like this presentation that Dr. Caccese made for us. And Dr. Caccese and I had already worked together in our previous life and in the lab. And I hope you all enjoy it. And I hope we have a lot of questions, and I hope we can generate a really good conversation between clinic and research. That's our main goal here. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Jaclyn Caccese. I am an assistant professor in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences at The Ohio State University, and also a member of Ohio State's Chronic Brain Injury Program. My background and training is in bioengineering, biomechanics, and motor control. So I am not a clinician, but my research does focus on both the short and long-term effects of repetitive head impacts in sport, as well as sport-related concussion. And so today I'm happy to share some of that research in my talk, Balance and Brain Injury, Sensory Sensitivity for Upright Stance Subacutely Following Concussion. So I think everybody has somewhat of an intuitive understanding of what balance is, because we use that word across multiple different contexts. But there's not really like a universally accepted definition of human balance. So in this talk, we're going to think of balance broadly as the ability not to fall. And so when we think about how somebody maintains balance, there are two things we often consider. One is the position of the center of mass, and the other is the area of the base of support. So we can see here the line of gravity through the center of mass in both the pug and the child, as well as the base of support outlined in the kind of red circle here. And so when we compare these two things, having a wider base of support, like the pug, for example, increases our balance, so to speak, because we have that wider base of support. If we extend this to humans, we can think of it like it's easier to remain balanced in a wide stance than in a more narrow stance. So what happens when the line of gravity falls outside the base of support? Well, if we were like an inanimate object, like a chair or something like that, we'd simply fall over, topple to the ground. However, humans, we can make corrective actions before we fall. So for example, when we're walking, both the base of support as well as the center of mass are constantly moving within each step. And so with each step, the center of mass falls outside of that base of support. So in that case, walking is like a series of controlled falls. And so in complex environments, we have to sense our environment. So here, when you're walking on a trail, an uneven surface, we're sensing our environment all the time, and we're generating motor responses that correct for these different environmental conditions in a way to move our body and to restore balance so that we prevent falling. And so more specifically, we maintain balance through this closed loop system. So the position of the human body is perceived by our sensory systems, our visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems. The sensory information is then sent to the central nervous system, where the information from the different sensory systems are combined, and then a command is sent to the muscles, which obviously contracts to change the position of the body. And so if you think about this, when we think about people who have poor balance, there are a whole bunch of places where things could go wrong. We can have problems with the sensory systems themselves. We can have problems integrating that sensory information. We can have problems generating the motor command. We could have problems with our motor systems. There are a lot of places where the system can break down. And even beyond that complex system, we have a lot of compensation strategies that can help us maintain balance based on environmental conditions or injury. So for example, when we think of integrating our sensory information, we don't just take the average of all these sensory systems, we judge the salience of each sensory system, and we adjust our reliance on that system based on the salience of that sensory system. So in other words, we can reweight our sensory feedback based on the environment. In a pretty basic example, if we think about standing or walking in a dark room where we can't necessarily use that visual feedback, we have to rely more on vestibular and proprioceptive feedback. Similarly, if you're standing here in the example on a platform and a fast-moving train goes by, we'd fall over with the motion of the train if we were to just use all that visual information and not be able to disambiguate the environmental stimuli from our self-motion. So we can downweight our reliance on that visual information and upweight our reliance on the other sensory systems, the vestibular and the proprioceptive feedback. Or in the case if you're standing on a moving train and our proprioceptive feedback may be less reliable, in this case, then we can rely more on visual and vestibular feedback. So with so many places where things can go wrong and where the system can break down and so many potential compensation strategies, how do we actually narrow down where the system breaks down within a population? So if we have an injured population, how do we study how they maintain balance? And so in my lab, we use external sensory perturbations to see how that changes the system. So the three primary systems we investigate are the visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems, and I'll break each of these down individually next. So this is a picture of my lab at Ohio State. This is the immersive labs. You can see in the picture has a split belt instrumented treadmill in the middle, and then that's surrounded by a 5-meter virtual reality dome. And then there are cameras all around, so the little like purplish blue looking objects. And those pick up reflective markers that we put on the participant so we can quantify their movement as they stand or walk in that virtual environment. And so some of the types of things we do are move the scene when people stand or kind of rotate it back and forth as they're walking. And so if we want to understand how much somebody relies on that information, that visual information, we can move the visual scene and see how much the person moves in response to the visual stimulus. We use a similar method to understand vestibular feedback. So for those who may be unfamiliar, probably none of the clinicians in the room, I'm sure you are all very familiar with the vestibular system, but for some other listeners, this is our sensory system that's based in the inner ear, and it provides us with information about the head's orientation relative to gravity, which not only allows us to balance, but also to stabilize our head during movement and move our eyes. And so it works kind of like the accelerometers in your phone that tell you how your phone's positioned. As you rotate your head, it will pick up that feedback and you know, sense your orientation relative to gravity. So if you fixate your eyes on an object straight ahead, like your thumb, and you rotate your head from side to side, you'll see that your eyes will rotate accordingly to maintain that fixation on your thumb. In our case, we use a device called galvanic vestibular stimulation. So that's this device shown here. And probably throughout the presentation, I'll refer to it as GVS. And so we can place electrodes behind a person's ears. Depending on the setup, you can make it seem as though they're swaying forwards and backwards or side to side, depending on the orientation of those little blue and red electrodes there. And so we can make it feel like they're standing or swaying or even falling, depending on the setup. And so again, we can, similar to how we can perturb the visual system and then see how people respond, we can perturb the vestibular system and then see how much they respond to the GVS stimulus as well. And then finally, proprioception. So like our awareness of our position in space or how our body's moving in space. So if you think about this, if you wanted to try and bend your elbow to 90 degrees, you wouldn't necessarily need to look at your arm to do that. You can close your eyes and get to 90 degrees pretty easily. And in this case, to bias our proprioceptive feedback during standing, we use Achilles tendon vibration. So sometimes researchers study sensory feedback like the sensory systems work in silos, but that's not really how we process sensory information for balance. So we really need methods to allow us to study how these systems work, not in isolation, but how they work together based on environmental surroundings. And so this is the sensory reweighting paradigm designed by my postdoc mentor, John Jaclyn. And so we use this to understand how individuals dynamically reweight that sensory information. So we can stimulate each sensory system at a different frequency and across 4 different conditions to determine how much somebody's relying on each sensory system. So if we think about this specifically, the visual system, we use a sinusoidal translation of the visual scene. So the visual scene's moving back and forth like a sine wave at 0.2 hertz. The vestibular system, same idea, sine wave with a 1 milliamp galvanic vestibular stim at 0.36 hertz. So you see 2 different frequencies. And then the proprioception is bilateral Achilles tendon vibration. So the vibrators turn on and off at 0.28 hertz. So there's a 3rd frequency. So we're stimulating them at 3 different frequencies. And the visual stimulus is presented at 2 different amplitudes. So there's a low vision and a high vision amplitude. And then that allows us to also assess people's reliance across different visual amplitudes. And we'll talk more about what those data look like in a minute. And then there's also 2 levels of vibration. So the vibration's either on or off. And again, to measure how there's a change in sensory reliance with or without those proprioceptive perturbations. So ultimately, there are 4 conditions. There's the low vision with vibration with GVS. There's the low vision without vibration with GVS. There's the high vision with vibration with GVS. And there's the high vision without vibration with GVS. And I alluded to this on the last slide, but each sensory stimulus is applied at a different frequency. So we can quantify the individual contributions of that sensory modality by analyzing postural sway at the stimulus frequency. So in this case here, quantifying COM sway at 0.2 hertz for the visual gain or 0.28 hertz for the vestibular gain. The same thing applies to proprioception at 0.36 hertz, but I couldn't fit that on this slide. So again, there are 4 different conditions, 2 with low vision, 2 with high vision, 2 with vibration on, 2 with vibration off. And what we're really interested in here is the change in sensory reliance across these 4 conditions to understand how the central nervous system is reweighting this sensory feedback. So for example, in gain to vision, when we go from the low vision to the high vision condition, we decrease our reliance on vision. So again, like that fast-moving train, if something is moving very quickly or at a high amplitude in our visual field, we might rely less on vision and rely more on our other sensory information. Similarly, when we remove the vibration, so when we go from vibration on to vibration off, we also see a decrease in our visual gain. And so to explain this, if you think about removing the vibration, now you can rely more on proprioception, so you don't have to rely as much on vision. So we can see both the intramodal reweighting, so how our gain to vision changes as a response to the visual stimulus amplitude. And we can also see this intermodal reweighting. So when we remove vibration, for example, how that changes our reliance on vision. Similarly, this is gain to GVS, our gain to our galvanic vestibular stim, which gives us an idea of vestibular reliance. And here we can see our intermodal vision effect. So you can see when you go from low vision to high vision, we have to rely more on vestibular function because we're relying less on visual information. And similarly, when we go from vibration on to vibration off, we rely less on vestibular feedback because, again, we can rely more on proprioception. So similar to what we saw in the visual feedback. And then finally, in proprioception, you see when you increase our gain to vision, you have to increase the, or when you increase the visual stimulus amplitude, you have to increase your reliance on proprioception because you're relying less on vision. So this paradigm really shows you how complicated this sensory reweighting is with both intermodal and intramodal components. So how do we leverage these techniques for sport-related concussion assessment? So I should start by clarifying that a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. It causes a number of different physical, cognitive, emotional symptoms. Most concussions recover within 2 to 4 weeks, but sometimes people have, prolonged recovery. And what I think is most interesting is that some of the research is suggesting even when clinical symptoms have recovered, there are still these underlying neurophysiological impairments that sometimes may persist beyond symptom recovery. So for example, a couple studies have shown that postural control impairments, when you use sophisticated laboratory equipment as opposed to our typical clinical assessments for postural control, like the balance error scoring system. When we use these more sophisticated measures, we may have prolonged postural control impairments up to, depending on the study, up to 90 days or more post-concussion. Without these resources, again, the clinical assessments seem to suggest that our postural control recovers within 2 to 5 days post-injury. So again, these quantitative assessments and clinical assessments sometimes don't agree. And that's a potential problem because obviously athletes are cleared when the clinical measures recover. And this raises some concern of whether some return to play decisions are premature, which may have consequences. For example, there's research suggesting that athletes are at 2 to 3 times increased risk for subsequent concussion and or subsequent musculoskeletal injury following recovery from their initial concussion. And so we really need to figure out, if there are persistent neurophysiological deficits, maybe we can return people to play and that's fine, but they can continue to do targeted rehab interventions to help recover in some of these other domains that may have persistent impairments. And so we had hypothesized that, these persistent postural control impairments may be due to maladaptive sensory motor control after concussion. But again, the specific physiological mechanisms were unknown and really still are unknown. We have a pretty small sample size, but pretty large effects in the data that we'll be presenting. So again, we use the previous sensory reweighting paradigm to understand the mechanisms underlying postural control impairments following concussion. And so these data are collapsed across conditions. So the figure on the top left is the gain to vision, the top right is gain to GDS, and the bottom left is gain to vibration. We studied 3 groups. So in all 3 figures, they're across the x-axis. The first is the no concussion group. This is our control group. They never had a history of concussion. The next group is the concussion history group, which they have some remote history of concussion, but not in the past 6 months. And then the third group was more of a subacute concussion group, if you will. They were between 2 weeks and 6 months post-injury, but they were all asymptomatic at the time of testing. And so what you can see is the gain to vision and the gain to GDS were higher for both the concussion history group and the recent concussion group relative to the control group, but there were no differences in gain to vibration. And so if we break it down across conditions, again, top left is gain to vision, top right is gain to GDS, and bottom left is gain to vibration. Red here is the recent concussion group, yellow is the concussion history group, and black is the control group. And there are no differences in sensory reweighting. So in other words, there were no differences in gains across conditions, but again, you see the overall higher gains to GDS and vision in the recent concussion and the concussion history groups compared to the control group. And so this suggests that concussion participants had an abnormal reliance on visual and vestibular information. And when we say concussion participants, we mean both groups, the recent concussion as well as the concussion history group. So how do we interpret these findings? Well, clearly there's a destabilizing effect of visual field motion and vestibular stimulation following concussion. And contrary to what we hypothesized, we actually thought the concussion history group was going to be a second control group. But actually, these impairments seem to persist even years following the concussion. And so we speculate that these findings may be a result of either suboptimal sensory reweighting, so specifically in this case, visual and vestibular reweighting, or abnormal sensory to motor transformations. So there are 2 places where that can go wrong. Because gain to vibration seem to be fine, we do suspect that it's this that it's the suboptimal sensory weighting, which may suggest that there are changes in our perception of sensory cues. So essentially, we have more noisy sensory feedback from both visual and vestibular systems, which actually would be consistent with some of the symptoms we see following concussion, including dizziness and imbalance. And then these changes in sensory perception may also be a result of ambiguity between self-motion and environmental motion. So typically, when we have ambiguity, we resolve that ambiguity using the other sensory systems. So if we have visual ambiguity, we can rely more on our proprioceptive or vestibular systems. But following concussion, it seems like both visual and vestibular sensory systems seem to be affected. So maybe they can't resolve that because we have higher noise, more imprecision in 2 sensory systems, or maybe they haven't learned how to combine that sensory information to cancel out the noise yet. And we actually have some evidence of that, learning to use multiple sensory systems to cancel out the noise in individuals in that concussion history group, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. But if you are interested, hopefully we'll have these data published in the nearish future. So the take-home message is that there are persistent visual and vestibular impairments for postural control following concussion. And so hopefully we can use this information to develop targeted rehab interventions, to design clinical tests based on physiological mechanisms, and to inform return to play decisions. I should say that these data are all collected in collegiate athletes, so I don't really know if they can be extended to more severe TBI children, older adults, populations that might have different mechanisms underlying the balance impairments following brain injury. And thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions now. You can also reach out to me via email or Twitter with any other questions that you may have.
Hello, welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Caccese, for doing that recording for us. So we do have a couple of questions here in the chat, and I'm going to kick it over to Fernando to host this Q&A.
Okay, great. I always have to look at it again to see if my microphone is not muted. Modern life problems, right? So before we start with the questions that we had there, and there's one there that you have to answer, I like to kick off this with three quick questions. First of all, is what are some implications of having higher gains in a sport environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think one of the things that we have to remember is, especially really during any sport, you have a lot going on, right? There's a lot of, it's very dynamic, right? So you're trying to run, people are running past you, you're trying to avoid, in the case of like contact sports, like football, your opponents while still carrying out some objective on the field. So there's kind of like overload, right? There's so many different things in your environment that you have to be perceiving and responding to. So if you are having any type of problems with sensory feedback, or dual task conditions, that might be exacerbated in really dynamic situations like trying to play on the field. And so I think one of the things that we're interested in is how this relates to subsequent injury. So if there are these persistent deficits in sensory motor processing, does that contribute to re-injury, either subsequent concussion or subsequent musculoskeletal injury, which, as I indicated in the presentation, it is quite substantial after initial concussion.
Okay, great. Let's just go to the first question that we had there at our chat. So, what does the speaker feel is the best return to play metric? That's a really hard question, I'll say.
Yes, that's a hard question to answer. Well, it might be getting easier.
Yes. It's
based on the article out of BJSM this week. We're getting a bit closer, maybe, to having some type of objective biomarker. But regardless, I mean, concussion is still a clinical decision, right? It's informed by these objective tests, but really it's a clinical diagnosis with feedback from a physical exam. And so in terms of return to play, I think it's kind of like big picture. So, some of these persistent deficits we're seeing, you really have to probe the system to see them, right? In many cases, if you just have somebody stand or walk, even if it's on a force plate or, with some sensitive equipment, a lot of these deficits don't really appear until you start probing the system. And so, as I indicated, this could be something that even beyond clinical recovery and return to play, we continue to work with athletes to rehab some of these more subtle things that maybe they can still get back onto the field, but they could benefit from some additional training to kind of address some of these sensory motor impairments.
Great. So now let's go to the, sorry, Katie, I know you, but she will answer this question at the end. But let's go to Ben's question here. I believe I saw that you were using the treadmill to vibrate the subject. Have you compared the input signal for the vibration to the output from the treadmill surface? Let me start by saying that she didn't use the treadmill to do the vibration. She used two haptic sensors, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, so that was a bit misleading because the picture was taken on the treadmill. So we do a variety of standing and walking assessments. And so the person was standing on the treadmill, but just to get the readings from the force plates, which we ended up not using, but because we were looking at center mass position or estimated center mass position, but from the motion capture system. But the thing we used for the vibration were little custom made Achilles tendon vibrators, which just have a motor and get strapped onto the ankle.
Great, great. Yeah, I remember those. And so what do you think are the next steps in understanding sensory motor function after concussion?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple areas where I want to target, but one is looking at throughout recovery. So there were two different concussion time points, right? You could call it an acute and a chronic time point, in the sense that, you know, one was within 6 months and the other was outside of a year post-concussion. But we don't really know how that recovery process works, and if it's different for some clinical profiles than others. So I think those are two questions we need to address. So as I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, concussion really results in a diverse array of symptoms, right? Anything from cognitive difficulties, mood disorders, like across the spectrum. And so there's some movement towards looking at clinical profiles, so based on what type of presentation a person has. And we didn't have the sample size in this study to look at that, but I think it would certainly be kind of a next step to see if people who fall into that, say, vestibular cluster have different postural control impairments than people who fall into visual clusters, or even cognitive mood, you know, and how maybe sleep or the neck kind of play into that. But I think the other thing that is interesting is to follow individuals throughout recovery. So not only recruit two different samples and look at them cross-sectionally, but look at them more longitudinally at several time points throughout their recovery. Now, of course, we can't do this too acutely post-concussion because people will get sick. But I think, you know, if we get people maybe 72 hours or more out, and then follow them through 6 months or even beyond, I think that's also an interesting next step.
Nice. The next question here, I kind of can answer that a little bit too. The next question from Rebecca is, are you looking at any functional vestibular testing to also correlate this with your laboratory measures, things such DVA or gait stabilization?
So we have not done that yet. With that being said, now since I transitioned to OSU, I have a great vestibular collaborator, Dan Merfeld, who does not specialize in concussion, but does specialize in everything vestibular related. So we are going to do some objective vestibular testing, and then hopefully also in time, it will take some time to get everything up and running, but in time, some vestibular threshold assessments as well, which should give us some measure of vestibular precision.
So quick insight here from the studies. When I started to, I don't know if you remember, we did actually test VEMPs and we test VHIT for acute, so right after soccer headings. And we didn't have a large number of subjects, but the results at that time, they were really inconclusive. So it was kind of all over the place at that time. But again, it was not an extensive study. We didn't have a lot of subjects, and it was actually just really pause soccer heading. Let's go to the next one. He had to step out. I don't know if Ben is still there, but he was wondering if you use linear measurements like entropy, DFA, exponents, and quantify their behavior?
So we haven't done that with our sensory reweighting paradigm. I do think it's an interesting question. I have done, I've looked at both approximate and sample entropy just from spontaneous sway. And I agree, it will likely give us some additional insight. This is pretty early on in the research. I think there's a lot of directions we can go. So I completely agree with you. It's just not something we've done yet.
And a nice insight again for Rebecca is recent. She says recent evidence has shown that VHIT changes pre-post injury does not change, and it's more central vestibular dysfunction. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons too why we're interested in some of those vestibular thresholds, because that should give us some insight into the central processing as well.
Nice. My last question. Oh, someone else, please enter. Oh, that was not me, but okay. I just have one last question. I think you already answered that, but just, to go over again, do you think that these deficits that you found out there are something that recover with time?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. Whether there's recovery or adaptation or compensation, I'm not sure. There are certainly things that recover. So some of the data that I didn't present today, we also did calculate more of the traditional postural measures like area, velocity, and those do recover in the concussion history group. There were no differences between the no concussion history and concussion history group on some of those more traditional postural control measures. With that being said, they obviously still had higher gains to visual and vestibular perturbations. So the question is kind of how, right? So it seems like it's a compensation mechanism where maybe they're able to rely more on multisensory information. So use both feedback from visual and vestibular systems to kind of cancel out the added noise in the system. Again, a lot of this is like totally theoretical. We don't actually know what happens, but that's a good guess anyway, or a reasonable guess.
Okay, that was my last question. We know each other personally. We've been talking about concussion for I don't know how many years now. So
yes. So sorry, I can also see some of the comments coming in, but about upweighting other systems, compensation versus adaptation. Yes. So I also think there's somebody at Nationwide Children's Hospital, which is one of our affiliates, who is interested in potentially combining with EEG. Now we can't do that with the GVS, but we can do it with some of the visual perturbations. So things like FNIRS or EEG can kind of complement some of these methods as well. But again, not something that we've looked at.
Great. Any more questions? Charles, so Charlie, he sent us something there that we'll take a look at that.
He said that he thought the most interesting finding was the fact that those quite a while post-concussion still have persistent findings. Yeah, so we did too. As I alluded to in the presentation, we actually thought they were going to be a second control group, and they weren't. So that was interesting and frustrating at the same time. But I do think that that's something that we should follow in the future, and in a larger cohort and kind of more systematically recruit for that. Yes, okay. I agree about the lower extremity risk too. Absolutely.
Okay, with that, I think I know we'll have questions for days here, and we'll have much to discuss. But I think this is a good start, to have conversation going.
And just to get back to Katie's question, my bracket was busted. I was very sad about Ohio State's loss. Yes.
Yes.
Totally.
Thank you for reminding that. Great. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Caccese. Thank you, Dr. Santos. This has been a really interesting conversation. And I think a lot of the comments and the questions were excellent as well. This is just we're going to have a lot of these webinars, and we welcome your ideas about the kinds of topics and research that we should cover. So if you have any more questions about this topic, or any suggestions about who we should be inviting to speak, anyone to refer to, perhaps yourself, your own research, please, follow us on social media. We were at Bertec HQ on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff, Facebook. So please follow us and continue the conversation. In a few weeks, we actually have Dr. Charles Shearer, who posts some good questions. And he'll be covering, he's a neurooptometrist. He's going to be hosting a conversation around vision, balance, and motion, to kind of build off the vision side of this and continue on the conversation. And again, this will be on our YouTube channel. So please share and follow and all that good stuff.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And again, I think when you post it to the YouTube channel, you'll post my contact info, but feel free to reach out to me via Twitter, email, whatever. I'm always around.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.